This happened back in September of 2017. Me and a good buddy of mine went camping at Lake Murray, Oklahoma. The place happened to be dark, very dark, where we were camping. And me and him, while setting up the tent, since we kind of got there a little later than normal, saw something that freaked both of us out. At first, it appeared to be just some sort of shadow, but it was moving. We also both noticed how unusually tall it was. And at first, my friend and I both kind of bantered back and forth if it was a person, maybe it was a park ranger, we didn't know. But the figure was moving very, very strangely. We couldn't really discern whether it was coming towards us or going deeper into the woods, or even going left and right. It was kind of swaying back and forth, and maybe after a few moments of watching it, or him, or whoever it was, we came to the conclusion it was probably just somebody who was drunk. So we ignored it, went back to setting up our tent, and that was that. My friend and I shared the same small tent, so we climbed inside, getting ready to shut down for the night. But that's when we started hearing some strange growling noises, if that's what we could even call them. My friend and I both looked at each other, with the same kind of "did you hear that" expression on our face. We grabbed our military-grade flashlights, turned them on, and walked outside the tent. We shined them both in that direction that we saw this thing before, but we didn't see it. And at the time, you have to remember, we both were convinced it was a person, a drunken person. And I guess, in our minds, we thought this person was about to stir up some trouble. We weren't about that. So we started shining our lights around, and not too far off were these small little beads of light. They would turn out to be red eyes of whatever this thing was. So we shined a light on it. We could see the tiny little beads of light. And then this being, and I say being because I don't know what it was, stood up. And we could tell it was some sort of wolf creature, covered in this long, dangly fur, matted almost. It looked disgusting. I swear, this thing, whether it was a person in a costume or not, looked completely savage. My friend and I both shut off the light and scurried back in our tent, completely crapless. And I say that because, well, we pretty much emptied our pants right then and there after seeing this thing. What's also really weird is the night went completely silent after that. The crickets now seemed to be dead. There wasn't any noise. You could hear a pin drop outside of our tent. It was eerily quiet. My dad's been a long-time hunter, and he always used to tell me, be careful when the woods go quiet. It generally means there's a large predator nearby. Now, I don't know if that has anything to do with what we experienced, but something definitely happened. Something that has bothered me. It took a while for us to fall asleep. I don't think I fell asleep for a few more hours, but we never heard anything come near our tent, and the rest of the night stayed completely silent. I still don't know exactly what that creature was that we saw. I say creature because I'm convinced it was not somebody in a costume. This looked like a real-life creature, or animal, whatever. We got up in the morning and both agreed to dismantle our tent, pack it up, and maybe go somewhere else. There wasn't any more talk about the creature or what it could have been. We just accepted it for what it was and moved on with our life, like many people who submit stories to you should probably do. Also, when we were dismantling our tent, I didn't try and take any time looking for tracks or anything out of place or out of the ordinary. I didn't smell, see, or hear anything out of the ordinary either. Just that one sighting the night before. There was nobody else nearby in the spot we were at. So, again, I have no idea what it is we experienced, but I have a feeling it was supernatural. I believe I saw something that wasn't human, back in July of 2017 while camping with my family in Mississippi. The area, as it turned out, was pretty dark at night. Imagine that. But usually with moonlight. This area, in which I've camped before with my family, is pretty bright. I guess those are only the nights that I remember that actually had full moonlight. This night, there was practically no moon visibility, so it was a little more eerie. Our camping was pretty ghetto too. We didn't have a fancy RV. We just kind of camped in the back of my parents' car. And as we're sitting there, lying down, trying to go to sleep, remember it's probably about 10:30 p.m., and we hear this soft sound coming from outside the car. At first, my sister and I started to hear it. I don't think my parents did. It kind of resembled this soft whispering noise, but then quickly turned into this grunting sound. My sister and I sat up, looking out the window to see what made the noise. We didn't see anything, but at that moment, we noticed both our parents snoring away. They must have been exhausted from the drive. A minute later, we see this wolf-like creature walking in front of our car, and it turned and looked directly into the car, right at my sister and I. We both covered our mouths in unison, trying our best not to scream. After all, we didn't want to wake up Mom and Dad. This thing was tall and had very long back-bent legs. It didn't appear to walk fast, but I guess it spotted us and then just decided to walk off, casually, like nothing ever happened. Like what it had just did was business as usual. See, I never believed this sort of stuff until now. But when I saw what this thing looked like, I couldn't believe my own eyes. I don't want to use the term werewolf. That sounds so ludicrous. And I know for sure this wasn't some prankster wearing a costume, trying to convince people he was scary. This was some upright walking dog, I guess, since that's pretty much what it looked like. Yeah, it was freaky. Scared the hell out of me and my sister. My sister and I both just kind of held each other after that, shortly after it walked away. We did our best to try and fall asleep, and at some point we did. The next morning, my parents awoke, asked us how we slept, and we both agreed and said everything was fine. We never told our parents. Even still to this day, they don't know what happened. After that morning, we drove to the next camp spot. That is hands down the only out-of-the-ordinary experience I've ever had in my entire life. Not my story, but actually my husband's. He's not too good at writing, so he told me this story multiple times and sat down with me as I wrote it out for him. Now, this was back in 2014, and my husband is quite the fisherman. Not so much anymore with the whole pandemic, but he used to go out all the time, when he could. My husband at this point in time was fishing down out of New Orleans. He has extended family down there, and so he uses that as an excuse to fish. Well, he tells me he was fishing at this lake, and he kept getting this sensation that someone or something was watching him. After ignoring it for quite some time, maybe 30 to 40 minutes, he finally got sick of it, started looking around for the source of these feelings. When off to his left, maybe no more than 100 yards away, right in the tree line, was this large black figure. My husband claimed it had to have easily been around 9 feet tall, and was massively wide, like the size of a linebacker on steroids. My husband got so terrified, he packed up right then and there, and just left without saying anything. Now, he's not exactly sure what the figure was, but has tried to convince me over and over again there's no way this could have been a person. It was far too big and far too bulky. Even though, due to the daytime and where the sun was in the shade, you couldn't see much details, but the silhouette of whatever this thing was pretty clear, and he could tell that it was humongous. Who knows how long this thing had been sitting there at the tree line, watching my husband fish. It kind of gave me the creeps when he told me about it, especially considering my husband isn't a storyteller. Sure, he'll tell stories of his fishing stuff, but not like this. He was genuinely scared when he got back from his trip and began to tell me what had happened. I guess when he told some of his extended family about what he saw, they were just like, "Yeah, those are called wood boogers. We have them all around here in the woods. You gotta watch out. Some of them aren't so friendly." So I'm guessing that what my husband possibly encountered was a Bigfoot. We're a couple that has never paid any mind or interest in that whole field of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, whatever you call it. So it's completely new territory for both of us. While I'm still skeptical, to say the least, my husband sure is a believer that that is what he saw, since he ruled out that there's no way at all it could have been a human, unless humans somehow get to around 400 to 500 pounds and 9 feet tall. Oh, I also want to add this. The spot at which he was fishing is pretty isolated. He said that there's no reason there should have been anybody else out there. To get out there, it's quite a drive, and a lot of brush and wilderness around is very thick, also very dangerous. The figure, even though it was technically at the other side of the lake, the portion of the lake he was at had a very short distance to the other side, which means that whatever this figure was had to have been and had to have come from a deeper portion of the woods, further into the swampy wilderness. All of these things just add up, and again, while I'm not 100% convinced this was the work of a Bigfoot, it's certainly disturbing, to say the least. Camping with my family back in 2016, we had something very strange happen to us. No, we didn't see anything extravagant, nothing crazy. It's more so what happened the following morning after we had slept. So the family and I were in an RV and parked just along offside a older road. The pull-off being just barely big enough to hold our entire 30-foot RV. The area around us was very dense in foliage. This was in the summertime, so everything normally is very overgrown, very thick, very dense. We were on our way to, I can't remember the camp spot, but one of the camp spots we visited. Sometimes in the summer, we would kind of route around to different camp spots, spend a day or two here, move to the next one, spend a day or two there, move to the next one. This was kind of our thing, and we did this often. And because of this, we had gone to so many, so that's why I can't exactly remember. And a lot of times, we would go the more scenic route. I don't know why, but it would take longer, but my dad enjoyed the views of the back roads versus the busy highways and interstates. So we turn off onto this pull-off, turn the car off, or I should say the RV, and everybody gets ready for bed. Everybody crashes out, everything is good. We wake up the next morning. My dad steps outside to have a cigarette, when we all start to hear him flip out. Now, we're all kind of frightened because we have no idea why he could be so scared. So we go outside, and he's kind of half terrified, half pissed. On the back side of the RV were these massive dents in the side. It looked like something big, like a silverback gorilla, had punched dents all along the back and the side of the RV. We were kind of all in shock and awe, wondering what happened. We had just refueled the evening before, and these weren't here. Nobody hit us. We had been driving. So where did these massive dents come from? Did they come from something or someone overnight? And if so, how did we not wake up to them? These are questions all of us asked each other, wondering, are we going crazy? Have these been here all along and we just never happened to see them? I guess one of these dents must have interfered with something mechanical of the RV, because my dad was saying the RV was having a hard time starting, which doesn't really make much sense to me because, well, I'm not a mechanic, but I think the engine's up front, so I'm not quite sure how these massive dents in the back would have anything to do with the mechanical side of the RV not starting. We were stuck there for a little while. Fortunately, my father had service and had to get a mechanic that dealt specifically with RVs. It was quite the wait, so we kind of hung outside for a while, hung back in the RV, and back and forth. But at some point or another, hanging outside just began to feel uncomfortable. Not only because it was so desolate, but because, I don't know, I feel like we were being watched. That might be really cliche to say, but I kept having these feelings like from the movie Deliverance, like there were some psycho-cannibalistic hillbillies watching us. That's probably completely wrong, but either way, I began to feel really uncomfortable outside. That feeling of being watched just wouldn't go away, although I looked multiple times and I never saw anybody or anything. In fact, I don't think we ever saw another soul on that road the entire time we were there, nor did we ever hear a car go by. Eventually, about noon or 1 p.m., the mechanic showed up. We got things taken care of, although I don't know what happened, but that's irrelevant. The RV started again, and we were all good to go, and we got out of there. Now, as far as the massive dents go, it looked like the Hulk had punched about 4 or 5 really big dents in the back of the RV and on the side. My question is again though, how did that happen without anybody not waking up? The amount of force that would take and the sound it would create would be massive. Maybe you can help me solve this one. I have a pretty crazy story for you. This was when I was 12 years old, so back about 2005. I was with a good friend of mine, and we were both about 12-13. This was also in the state of Mississippi. We had walked off the trail where we were at. This was a campground, but instead of following the hiking trails like our parents told us to do, we decided to be 12 and 13, and respectively walked quite a bit of ways away, and actually got lost. We walked for probably about 2 miles if I had to guess. We were both very athletic, and our families often camped together, hiking all the time, so a mile or two here and there was really nothing to us. Not like most kids nowadays, who are so glued into their damn phones, they can't even be bothered to walk 300 feet without being winded. We were pretty well versed in the outdoors too, since, again, our families and parents were nature buffs. But we were not experienced woodsmen, not by any stretch of the means. We were still just young boys. And what we found this day still really disturbs me. In fact, there's many nights I have nightmares about it, just because it's so gross. So I want to say at this point, we were probably only about a half mile off the trail, but we didn't realize that. We were walking in a direction that we thought was away from the trail, but really was more so paralleling the trail, closer to a 90-degree angle. And at some point or another, my friend and I came across this old outhouse. Not like a honey bucket. This was like an old wooden outhouse. You could tell it used to be here for something. There was even kind of an old etched dirt path all around it, leading off, but with all the overgrowth, it doesn't look like it had been in use in quite some time. Now, what I assume from finding this is that this outhouse used to be in use long, long, long ago. But at some point, as they developed the park more and made more changes, they probably, instead of tearing it down, just let it be, and kind of let nature take its course and overgrow the original path. That's what it looked like. It looked to be a pretty old outhouse. I mean, if I had to guess, maybe the 60s or 70s. It hadn't been used in quite some time. But as we saw it, and we started walking near it, we got a whiff of this awful smell. If you've ever smelt roadkill, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's just this putrid, rotting meat, hot garbage smell. And then we could hear the flies buzzing. So we assumed there was a dead animal nearby, or maybe somebody had taken a large crap in this outhouse. Maybe somebody else is using it, or they got lost. But being 12 and 13, we kind of dared each other to go check out the bathroom, just in case, because that's where the smell seemed to be coming from. After enough you go first and you go first, we both decided to slowly approach the outhouse. When I touched the door handle, the door just kind of slid open. There was no lock on it or anything. And as soon as the door slowly opened, we both screamed and ran. Sitting in the outhouse was a body. Not just a body, but just a torso. The legs, arms, and head had been completely severed from the body, and there were no clothes. It was a male. It was just lying there. Not so much covered in blood, but it seemed to be somewhat fresh. Probably within the last 48 hours, I would imagine. It's not like my friend and I sat there, observing all the murder details and looking at it, the way CSI or a coroner would. We opened the door, saw that it was clearly a real severed torso, and we ran. And we ran, and we ran some more. And eventually, we broke into camp. We were more thankful that we could find people than we were to realize we were not lost. We ran to the nearest ranger we could find, or whoever works at these parks. We told them exactly what had happened and what we saw. Within hours, police were involved and they had the entire area taped off. They were asking us questions, but very minimal, like the condition in which we found it in, what we were doing, those kinds of things. We never got any concrete answers and, we were just kids. I didn't expect us to. All I can assume is that somebody had probably murdered somebody and stuck their torso in this old outhouse, which would explain the smell. Now, whatever said person did with the head, arms and legs, that I don't want to know about. But the fact that there was a murderer, a serial killer, probably nearby us the whole time we camped, that disturbs me more than what my friend and I found. My friend and I don't really talk about it much to this day. In fact, we don't really talk a whole lot anymore at all. Not because of what happened, but just because of life and the pandemic, and you kind of just go your own separate ways. But we still do talk from time to time. The last time we talked about it was probably 2 years ago. We still have no idea who did this or what, but are both convinced there was a serial murderer out there. And maybe, just maybe, we could have been next. The most disturbing thing to have happened to me was probably when I was camping with my friend, out in the woods in his backyard. I guess you can call it his backyard. But at the very edge of him and his parents' yard was just miles and miles of forest. I guess it was more like undeveloped land, actually. I don't know any of the specifics, like how many acres it covered or how many miles it went back. We were both 14, 15 at the time. We were hanging out basically doing nothing. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we both decided to get creative and go maybe camp out in the woods, because why not? It was the summertime after all. I told him that sounded like a pretty fun idea. So, after making sure his parents knew what we were going to do, we grabbed backpacks, stuffed them full of food and water, and ventured off into the woods. We were not experienced at all, but that didn't matter. Our mission, our goal, was to have a blast. We didn't actually make it that far into his backyard, or the backwoods, I guess you can call it. Maybe, probably 20 minutes, if I had to guess. It was probably closer to 15. But it was super creepy too. He kept making Blair Witch Project references the whole time. It didn't help set the mood at all. And I wish I didn't have to deal with that. Those movies never made me want to go camping ever. They seriously freaked me out. I guess we walked around now for about another hour, before we finally found a clearing and began setting up camp. It was now beginning to get dark. The whole process of us deciding we wanted to go camping, telling his parents, getting our backpacks and all the food and water, and actually making it out to the spot was several hours, just to set that clear. We set up the single tent to make sure everything was easy and good to go. And I think after a while we just sat around, telling stories and laughing, just having a good time. Because we were surrounded by dark, I think Jason, my friend, and I fell asleep pretty quickly. Now, sometime in the middle of the night, we didn't have a phone or any way to keep track of time, so I'm assuming it was in the middle of the night. We heard, and we both awoke to this, what sounded like some large animal right around our tent. I know that we don't have bears around here, but whatever it was sounded exceptionally heavy. Now, I was scared. I refused to get up, but I had a feeling that whatever it was, it knew we were in the tent. We didn't have bears, and we could hear it sniffing around. It sounded like a muskox or something. Even if this was just our imagination, it was terrifying. Jason shot up, grabbed his flashlight, and hit it as loudly as he could against the floor, then turned on the light in the direction that we heard this thing. As soon as that happened, this massively loud rustling happened, and without warning, whatever this thing was began screaming this horrible howl, as if it had been splashed with holy water. It had to have only been about 5 feet outside of our tent, and then we hear it running off, tearing into the woods. You could hear it running and crashing through brush, screaming for quite some time. That was more than enough of a hint. We jumped out of our tent, with our shoes barely on, and left mostly everything, except for our flashlights, booking it back to his house. Safe to say, I never went camping again after that. Just that event alone made me too scared to go back in and find out what it was. Obviously, we're lucky it didn't follow us, but his parents never found out that we came back and crashed on his couch instead. I remember leaving the next day, and I think at some point, he had to go back by himself and fetch the tent and the supplies, since they were his dad's. I never heard from him if anything happened after that. Still creepy as heck, though. Sometimes, the scariest things don't have to be full of bells and whistles. In fact, that's what happened, and it should have been impossible. There is no reason or plausible explanation, no matter how hard you look at it. A few years ago, I went hiking with my girlfriend, Casey, and we got caught in a storm. We are used to wind and rain, but this was unreal, completely unexpected. We made the decision to carry on and to try to find somewhere to find shelter and stay until the storm had passed. We were real deep into the forest. We were worried if we didn't find somewhere safe, we might be injured. As luck would have it, we stumbled across an old hut. It looked like maybe something hunters used, an old deer blind perhaps, but it was shelter, and that was what we needed. We've hiked and camped through all sorts before, but this was another level. The wind and rain battered against the sides of the hut, and as we huddled together for warmth, thankful that although the place was empty, it didn't seem as if it was used much. It was at least intact. I say hut, but this was a very crude makeshift shelter. There was no way of getting warm. We didn't have a change of clothes, but at least we weren't getting any more wet. Thankfully, we had flashlights, so at least we weren't in total darkness. The inside of the blind was pretty clean. It seemed whoever had used it at least tidied up after themselves. And at some point, as we began to dry out a little, the night drew, and we both began to drift off. I woke around 4 a.m. with a very stiff neck. I attempted to change positions and stretch a little. I woke Casey, who of course grumbled at me. It seemed the storm was coming towards an end. The wind certainly had eased. We both stood up, stretching our legs, attempting to shake out some of the cricks, when we heard a noise that terrified the both of us. Not a howl or a gunshot, a scream or anything cliché like that, but just as utterly shocking. There was a knocking, a 3 rap, knock, 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 very precise and clear. We had seen nobody on the trail, no sign of any sort of life as we hiked. It was pitch black outside, and although the storm had thankfully dissipated, we could still hear the rain drumming down on the roof, although softly. We stared at one another for a moment and then both in unison called out hello. We waited, but there was nothing. We looked at each other again, Casey now shaking her head, but I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, only to be greeted by nothing. We didn't sleep anymore that night. We simply waited for the sun to rise, then hightailed it out of there. Only before we left, I had a quick look around. Now, I'm a hiker and a camper, not a hunter, not a tracker. I couldn't see any signs of anything having been there, other than us. Our muddy footprints led up to the blind, nothing else. There were no obvious animal tracks, although I don't know what kind of animal is able to politely and precisely rap on a door like that. We headed back through the trail to the truck. Never saw anyone else, ours still being the only vehicle in the lot. We'll never know who or what knocked on that door. Maybe that's for the best. I remember this one time when I was going through one of those extreme endurance type phases, where I would go off for days and hikes on trails and often ending up deep in the middle of huge parks and forests, way off grid. I always went alone. I had a higher powered job that caused me no end of stress, and I saw those adventures as not only good for my body after being chained up to my desk, but also good for my mind. On this particular trip, I was planning on being out for 3 days. I was about halfway through day 1, deciding on the map how much further to go before finding somewhere else to make camp. The woods here were really dense, trees as far as the eye could see, so really any available clearing would do, or I would be looking at sleeping in some branches. Just as I was looking around, I heard a familiar voice say hello. At first, I thought I must be imagining it, although the trails I used aren't exactly out of bounds. They tend to be more off the beaten track, and therefore, it is far more unlikely that I bump into another human, which is just the way I like it when I'm decompressing. I turn around and see this guy, just a totally regular dude, dressed in a similar fashion, comparable in height and structure even. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" he had asked. I did mind, but figured there couldn't be any harm in it. We'd plow on for a while, and then once I found somewhere suitable, I'd bid him farewell and set up camp alone. I was there to unwind and not make a buddy. He'd made some small talk, and I mumbled some replies, picking up speed and hoping he'd get the hint. There wasn't really much of a path, and soon it became one person wide, so I went ahead, he following behind, still muttering occasionally. I'm not honestly sure when I noticed that he was no longer there. We'd been on the straight and narrow, a single-person track, for quite some time, so when I turned around, even if he was no longer right behind me, which he wasn't, I should have been able to see him still in the track. Nothing. I called out, realizing I didn't even know his name, but shouting, "Hey, you okay?" No answer. Just silence. That's when I actually realized just how quiet it had gotten. There wasn't any wind, any animal chitter, nothing. I called out again. Nothing. I walked back a ways, looking down at the trail, seeing only my boot prints. Weird thing was, I ended up going back real far, sweeping from side to side, seeing if there was any trace of him whatsoever. Even when I got back onto the wider path where we had walked more or less side by side, there were only my prints. I mean, he had literally disappeared without a trace. I know that hikers go missing on trails often, whether they got lost and die of starvation, injured and bleed out, or possibly attacked by a wild animal. Maybe sometimes they don't know they're dead. Yeah, it sounds crazy to me, but what else could that guy have been? Disappearing like that and leaving no footprints. Was this the ghost of a hiker? Next time you're watching one of those true crime type shows on Netflix, and you scoff and think that could never happen to me, just sit there for a moment. Think about my story. This occurred back in 2019, whilst I was out hunting boar. I had headed out really early since they tend to be pretty active in the early morning hours. It was a place I'd been to many times before, not just for a few years. Nothing much seemed to have changed though, as was to be expected. Normally, I feel a sense of peace when I'm out there. Excitement too, as the adrenaline of the hunt kicks in. But also, I find being in the woods relaxing. A sense of being one with nature, being top of the food chain. I don't tend to mess with the big guys like stags or bears, but a good-sized boar makes me feel powerful, and it makes a darn fine casserole. That day, however, I definitely felt on edge, like I wasn't fully alone, that someone was watching me. Now, that can obviously be explained by all the eyes on you from the creatures. Even if you're hiding from one you want to kill, there will be others watching. But I knew that feeling, and this wasn't like that. I even called out a couple of times, risking to give myself away to the pigs, but feeling that if somebody was dumb enough to just be taking their dog for a walk in this secluded area known for hunting, then I should at least warn them. I didn't want to be facing any charges or the police if I shot somebody. Turns out, I would end up be talking to the local sheriff anyway. You see, not long after, I had convinced myself I was just being a wuss, and there was nobody out here except me, my gun, and my future victims. Very serial killer, I know. But then I heard a scream. A very human, high-pitched female scream. Just as I was whipping around to see if I could get a sense of where it might have come from, there was one singular gunshot. It sounded like it had come from a shotgun. Silence followed suit. I stood stock still, my own shotgun locked and loaded, ready to shoot first and ask questions later if anybody came running out of the trees. I must have just stood there waiting for around 30 minutes, or it felt like that long, before I finally decided it was safe enough to run to my truck and get out of Dodge. Now, I have heard a lot of animal noises and am aware of coyotes, bobcats, foxes. They can all sound like a lady being murdered, especially during mating season. But this is boar and deer and rabbit and woodchuck territory. Feeling I needed to do the right thing, I reported it to the sheriff, who I kind of expected to look at me as if I'd been on the beers or smoking something I probably shouldn't have. Instead, he went kind of pale, asked me to show him exactly where I'd been on a map, and was on the phone before I'd even left his office. Turns out there had actually been an active serial killer in the area, kidnapping, murdering, raping, torturing, and other heinous things to young women. They'd been on the verge of warning people and enforcing a nighttime curfew, but hadn't quite gotten there. They found the woman I'd heard scream that afternoon, and by evening, the town was on lockdown. I had to go back to the sheriff to make my statement. Afterwards, he filled me in on a little bit more information. The Deep Woods Killer, as they name him, so far had 5 victims, the 5th being that woman I heard. 1, 2, 3, and 4 had a pattern. He kidnapped this girl, took her somewhere where they might encounter just one other person, always in the woods near somewhere he typically spends time. The woman would scream. He'd kill her, hunt and fish, would come to see what happened, and then kill them too. It suddenly dawned on me what that meant. I probably should have been victim number 6. I was meant to run towards the noise, wanting to help this damsel in distress, but instead I froze in my cowardice. I could have saved her life. I watched the news and did a ton of internet research, looking for cases, but I never saw anything. My guess is that they wrapped it up and hid it. From what I was told, and from what I understand, there are many serial killer cases that we will never know about because they are covered up so quickly. A lot of it due to the incompetence and covering up mistakes of local PDs because they didn't react fast enough where lives could have been saved. They covered up to save their own butt. Still, makes you wonder just how many serial killers are out there. Back in May of 2015, me and a few close buddies of mine went on a backpacking venture off in the mountains for 4 or 5 days. But it wasn't until the 3rd and 4th day that we would have our strange sighting of this person who seemed to be obsessed with following us around. Enough of background info. Let me jump right to the story. The first 3 days of camping and hiking went great. We would set up tent, fish, cook food, hike, rinse and repeat. And at nighttime, once we had established a firm camping spot, we would eat a lot of food, fish, drink beer, pass out, also making sure to keep well hydrated. It was a blast. Then, on the 3rd day, we saw what appeared to be another hiker, although he was dressed in very strange clothing, kind of looking like he came out of Jumanji or a Peter Pan movie. And unlike us, he also was not walking on any trail, but kind of off on a ridge in the distance, close enough that we could see him, see what he was wearing, and see that his behavior was strange, but far enough away we couldn't exactly see his face. As that day progressed, later into the late afternoon, we found a really nice camping spot right next to a small lake or a larger pond. Great trout, by the way. But halfway through fishing, we noticed we see that same guy again, who must have followed us at least 4 miles up trail. And now, he was standing on the opposite end of this small lake or large pond, just beyond the trees, keeping watch of us. My friend pointed him out to me, and I think we were all a little unnerved by the whole thing. So I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go talk to this guy. Give him the benefit of a doubt. Maybe he needs help. My friends thoroughly advised me not to, because we don't know who he is. We're out here in the middle of the woods all by ourselves. I mean, there's no telling if he had a weapon or anything. So I ignore that, and my gut instinct. So I go and try and talk to this guy. He sees me coming around the lake, coming towards him, and when I get maybe 100 feet away from him, he just takes off running in the opposite direction. So I just stop, and I'm like, alright, whatever. I'm not dealing with this. So I just turn right back around, walk back towards camp, and tell my friends everything that happened. They kind of just blow it off. I mean, some crazy man in the woods is following us around, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, the sun begins to go down, we start a fire, have some fish that night, a couple of beers and water, and we kind of forget all about this weird dude watching us in the woods. As we're getting ready to go to bed that night, I have to go take a leak in the woods. So I step just out of the range of the fire, just to go and relieve myself, when I could hear something or somebody crunching around in the leaves, not far away. Immediately, my attention is sprung up around me, and my eyes, at this point, have kind of somewhat adjusted to the darkness, since I wasn't in the light of the fire any longer. And I swear, maybe 4 trees away, I saw what appeared to be a person crouching behind a tree, watching me. Then I immediately remembered this guy from earlier, and I put all the dots together in my head. So I yelled out, "Hey, I know you're there. I could see you." And what does he do? He takes off running again. assuming that was who this was. I just hear them turn around and start bolting off, running. So without peeing, I walk back to camp, which is maybe 20 feet, and my friends are all alerted because they obviously had heard me yelling, asking me what was going on. I tell them what I saw and that I believe it was the guy from earlier. Now we're all kind of up in arms and kind of paranoid, not really sure what to expect next. After all, we didn't exactly know who this person was, or really what they were capable of. We had to have our guard up at all times to honestly be safe. We all just stayed up, huddled around the fire, and it kind of killed any good mood or vibe we had going on for the evening. I was beginning to think that he was going to attack our campsite, and we were all going to be murdered by the morning. And finally, about 1 or 2 in the morning comes, and we all decide that it's time to turn in. But I just could not shake the feeling that this creep out there was waiting for the right opportunity for us to fall asleep. So I climb into my sleeping bag, lay it on my head, and I try my best to attempt to sleep. My few friends are a little bit more inebriated than I am. Actually, at that point, I had no alcohol in my system at all, so I lie there awake for easily what felt like a whole other hour. My other 3 friends were snoring. I'm trying to fall asleep, but I just can't. I'm too paranoid, thinking that this guy is going to come and get us. I don't know. Then I hear somebody approaching our campsite, and now I'm fully alerted. I start listening intently, and I could hear footsteps approaching my friend's tent. Now I'm fully alert, ready for action, and stupid me did not bring a single weapon with us, except a dainty little pocket knife. I don't know what I was thinking, and when I look back, I'll always kick myself for this. I could hear whoever it was outside my friend's tent was feeling around. I could hear their hands running across the fabric of the tent, almost like they were looking for a zipper, which they probably were. The fire was just coals and embers now, so it should be pretty dark out there. I was in my own tent, by myself, and I had no idea what to do, how to alert their attention. Then, I hear the zipper start to slowly go down on their tent. I hear it go down just about all the way, and then silence. So I'm sitting there in my sleeping bag, realizing I have no weapon. And what if this guy comes to my tent and does the same thing? I'm completely defenseless. God forbid he has a gun or a knife. Or maybe this is some deliverance thing where I'm going to get raped. So I'm laying there, expecting to hear something, waiting for something to happen. But nothing ever does. And now I believe hours go by. And eventually, it starts getting light outside. And then the sun is coming up. As soon as there's even a glimpse of light, I jump outside my tent, enough that I can somewhat see around me. I quickly run over to my friend's tent, jump in there, and wake him up pretty violently, telling him, "Dude, what happened?" And of course, he's sound asleep. So I startled him, and he's like, "Why are you waking me up? What's going on?" I told him, "Dude, your tent zipper was wide open. Did you see what happened last night?" He looks completely confused and stunned as to what I'm even talking about. I told him I was lying in my tent last night after everybody else had fallen asleep, and I heard footsteps from the woods come up to your tent, open the zipper slowly, and, well, I told him I didn't hear anything after that. But as I'm explaining this to him, the color drains from his face because he too saw that guy the day before, so we only knew it could be one person. But he also says that some point early in the night, or the morning, he thinks he woke up and saw this figure standing just outside of his tent. But he convinced himself he was dreaming, so he fell back asleep. Now he knew that that was a reality. We both jump up out of his tent, completely creeped out, wake up our other friends, and kind of scour our campsite, looking for any evidence of anything he might have done. Nothing. No food or supplies were taken, or even rifled through. There's no tracks or evidence he was even here. Weird. Why would somebody come here? What was their purpose? And honestly, there's no telling how long he was standing there with the tent door open, watching my friends sleep. Just thinking about it makes me shudder. After that, we hiked back and got back pretty quickly. It did take the whole day, but we never saw that strange man again, and I hope we never do. I've been homeless a lot. I've lived in some distant families' land where they have old cabins up on stilts, due to the local woods flooding heavily sometimes. Illinois is weird. Anyway, I spent a good amount of time in this old cabin. Wood stove, porch swing hanging from the ceiling that I would use as a bed. Overall, it was an okay place, and it wasn't too far of a drive to town for food. You just had to tolerate the half-mile walk to your car. One day, I am out walking around the woods in a smallish clearing in the path. I see easily a good 50 to 60 dead geese. Every single one of them is mangled in horrific ways. Necks ripped off the body. Bodies splayed out over old timbers and fence posts. Feathers are everywhere. Bones sticking out of the dirt. It looked just like a straight-up goose genocide. The ground was dry, though. There was a whole lot of dust. I saw no prints. There was no other evidence of anything being in the area, aside from what can only assume was some sort of strange breed of exploding goose. I also found a torn open old backpack and a great deal of candy wrappers strewn about it, all way too moldy to identify anything about it. So I decided to turn back and see if I could grab a camera when I start hearing this god-awful shrieking noise, as if it were coming from every possible nook and cranny within a 30-foot radius. I took off pretty fast when that started. To this day, my best guess is some sort of massive commune of foxes. It really is the only rational solution I could come to. Still, scared me to death. Oh man, I hope someone reads this, 'cause holy cow. I enjoy primitive camping, and me and my wife go out sometimes just by ourselves. We usually bring the dog, spend a couple of nights. This time, though, we invited some friends for drinking shenanigans. Anyway, on the first day, we hear a vehicle coming down the road. Not odd. There are maybe 10 more sites on this several miles of road. It's a dirt road, with nothing there but these primitive sites. One way in, one way out. What is odd, though, is that the vehicle was a meatpacking truck, or maybe ice cream truck. It was old, really old, and all the lettering and signage was faded or had been taken off at some point. It was this fading beige and decrepit. None of us actually made out the person driving it, but there were no tags or plates on the back at all. So, we all get creeped out, but collectively kind of decide it wasn't as weird as we thought, and get back to enjoying our night. Flash forward to the next morning. My mom calls. She's panicking, freaking out. Apparently, some hikers were abducted near us. There are several girls at our site, including my wife, and she is convinced it was them. No names were released. I wanted to know how near, so I pulled up my GPS and an article I found about it with their last known locations. It was roughly about a half-mile away from where we were. I legit don't remember what happened after that, but I'm scouring the news from those years. It's a hard-to-find article. I want to say they found one of the girls tied to a tree. Apparently, there are quite a lot of people abducted and murdered on and near the parkway finding this. Pretty sure they never found the guy, but I guess it is the perfect place for any serial killer to act out his fantasies. Not exactly terrifying, but definitely a creepy find. So, this past summer, in 2017, I was working on a project monitoring amphibian larvae in vernal pools. Many of them were in the middle of a wide expanse of state land, largely unpatrolled. Technically, with no public access, but plenty of old logging roads and ATV trails that people don't usually use for poetic strolls at sunrise, or through nature, or even bird watching. I stumbled onto a lot of illegal dumps with weird things. Sofas, construction equipment, hundreds of chew cans, baby clothes, you name it. Not to mention plenty of abandoned camps and hangouts for people to shoot up heroin. Plenty of disposed of paraphernalia, after all. But, without a doubt, the creepiest thing I stumbled across, while all alone for about 5 miles from a paved road, following only game trails, was an upright, gently used baby stroller. There were toys in the storage areas, and a blanket still in the main area. I even have a picture of it on my old phone. I just stood there, staring at it. Like any moment, something from the hills have eyes was about to step out from the woods. I have no explanation for what or why this was out here, and I'm sure you don't either. I don't know if you would classify this as a scary encounter with some unknown humanoid being, but it was certainly strange, to say the least. I was out camping alone by myself in Arizona. I was on a small bluff, overlooking a little valley, maybe about 50 to 100 feet down. It wasn't that high up. It was early morning time. I was climbing out of my tent, making myself a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise above the horizon. It was simply breathtaking. But then something happened below me, in the rock. Keep in mind, I'm kind of out in the middle of nowhere, maybe a few miles from the nearest road. I have no explanation for why this happened. The ground underneath me began vibrating, and vibrating very heavily. It gradually increased until I was literally shaking. I was convinced it was an earthquake. But after gradually increasing and climaxing till about 20 seconds in, it suddenly stopped. And along with the heavy vibrations, and what I thought was an earthquake, was met with a very loud mechanical humming noise that all sounded like it was underneath me, like some large machine. After it stopped, I was pretty confused, but I didn't waste any time. I packed everything up and moved back on down the trail that I was hiking on. Maybe there's some sort of machinery underneath the rock, or perhaps maybe there's a military base. I don't know. It's all just speculation. But I will say that experience was probably one of the weirdest I've ever had while being out in the middle of nowhere. When I was 6 and 7 years old, my father, my uncle, and my grandfather would all take me to this really cool lake right near where we lived. I can't remember the name of it. It wasn't a natural lake. I'm pretty sure it was man-made. But my uncle, father, and grandfather all loved to fish in it. Said it was the biggest and best trout they had ever had. One day, they were sitting there, fishing, talking, having a couple of beers, and I was off, maybe 100 or so feet away, playing with sticks right by the tree line. I remember feeling a strange breeze blow on me, like warm or hot air. This was in June or July, so it was summertime, and not surprising to have a warm breeze. But it felt unnatural, and even in my 6 or 7-year-old mind, I understood and knew that, and I felt like I was in danger, which is interesting. Most 6 and 7-year-old kids don't really pick up on that kind of thing. We haven't got our feet wet yet in the woods, but somehow I just knew, deep down, there was something wrong. I remember it being a beautiful day, but the woods and everything around me were silent, other than the laughter and cutting up of my granddad, uncle, and father. And for some reason, like by some unseen force, I felt driven to go deeper into the woods, like something was pulling me, or I was being led. I'm not sure where, but I just felt the need to go deeper. And so I got up and began walking in the direction that I felt compelled to go into. As I began to walk just outside of the eyesight of my family, I heard them yelling and calling for my name. The problem with this is that the noises The people calling for me, supposedly my family, were actually coming from deeper into the forest. So I had to stop and think, even at 6 years old, wait a minute, my dad and family are over in the opposite direction. I honestly felt like I was in some sort of trance, and my legs just kept moving, even though I was trying to rationalize this at 6 years old, and trying to pull my way out of it. After maybe a couple more minutes, now my family was completely out of eyesight. They were too busy to even notice, and I found myself trying to pull myself out of this trance, and eventually I broke free, ran back to my family, and the entire time this is happening, I began feeling this immense feeling of danger, like something bad was about to happen. All the while, I was getting closer to the voices mimicking my family deeper in the woods. And it wasn't just mimicking my father. My grandfather, uncle, and father were all calling me, "Come on, come here," using my name, of course. I didn't actually end up making it to the area that I was being called to, but I was pretty darn close. Had I walked maybe another 100 yards, I would have been there. And there's no telling what I would have encountered or seen. I ran back to my family. I told them that somebody was calling me from the woods. My uncle and dad got up, went to go check it out. They were both armed. My grandfather sat with me next to the lake, told me all about stranger danger. And my uncle and dad came back, said they didn't hear nothing or see nothing. It was probably just the wind. The day resumed as normal, and as my life went on, I never really thought about that day much. But as I've gotten older and heard so many stories of skinwalkers or weird things going on in the woods, I can't help but think of this story that pops up in my mind. I had no idea that mimicking the voices of family members was even a thing until I discovered skinwalkers and beings like that. I can only really speculate that that's what was waiting for me. And after reading all the missing 411 books by David Paulides, I don't even want to know what it is that was going to grab me, assuming that's what was going to happen. I just wish my family would have took it more seriously. But I guess they did go out and look for me. I mean, what more could I ask for? So, I would really like your opinion on this. Do you think it could have been a skinwalker? Or maybe a Bigfoot? After reading a lot of the missing 411, maybe I could have been the next victim. We weren't close to any national parks. This was just a small wooded area, away from our rural community. Any answers you can provide, or any speculation would be much appreciated. My cousins and I ended up renting out a cabin for the winter up here in the mountains. While it's always been a beautiful and serene experience, there was one winter where we had an incident that a lot of us just don't talk about. It's actually quite terrifying, and after listening to many of your videos, I realized that it can easily constitute as its own scary story. This was back in the winter of 2007, so it was me and my 3 other cousins, my parents, and extended family. We have a pretty large cabin that was built, so we can all sleep in it pretty comfortably. It has a huge wooden stove, and my family is always keeping a giant stack of wood around to keep it going 24/7. Temperatures around here can plummet very low, and we of course like to be warm, just like anybody else. So, one night, we're all sleeping, me and my cousins in the main living room area, or the lobby if you call it that. On the side of the cabin is a large set of sliding glass doors. On the front of the cabin is a large wooden door. Both are attached to a large wooden deck that wraps around and has a staircase leading down to the ground. One night, while staying up with the family, talking, and of course the parents were drinking, so they were being obnoxious, and us cousins just wanted to kind of get away, so we decided to move our operations into one of the bedrooms to have just us time. We were playing a very intense game of Monopoly, and it was getting pretty serious. At one point, one of us looks out the window in the bedroom, notices that it's snowing very heavy, and kind of gets worried that we're going to be snowed in and not able to leave. This was this particular cousin's first time coming up here, but we assured him that this happens every winter and that we're going to be totally fine. He was also the youngest out of all of us. He seemed so fascinated with the heavy snowfall, but we weren't really concerned about that. We were just trying to finish this Monopoly game that seemed to go on and on forever, as it usually does. When it wasn't his turn, he kept going to the window and just watching the snowfall, completely mesmerized by how heavy the snowfall was, when at one point, closer to later at night, he began freaking out, saying there's something coming towards the cabin. We kind of dismissed it, thinking, oh yeah, there's large black bears out here. We're not surprised. And then he's like, no guys, it's running towards the cabin. A large black hairy man. So we all jump up and look out the window. Across from the cabin is a small little hill that dips down, and then it dips back up on the other side. Running down the hill towards the direction of our cabin was what I swear was probably a Bigfoot. It was a man, covered in all black. We didn't see any faces, but it looked like a giant man running through the snow. And already, there was probably 4 feet of snow. He didn't look like he was having much problems. And he was huge, right next to the pine tree. In that moment, though, I wasn't thinking Bigfoot. But, as an adult, that's what it had to have been. So all of us boys are screaming. We run out and try to tell our parents that there's a Bigfoot about to run into the house. They all just start laughing and joking, thinking we're just seeing things or making things up to try and distract them from drinking. So we all run to the window and look out. We don't see anything. And now all of our parents are telling us, come on, stop it. You guys are acting ridiculous. If this is your idea of a joke, it's not working. We tried convincing them of what we saw. They just wouldn't buy it. So we stood on the lookout, kept looking, but this large black man that we saw outside disappeared. We kept trying to dare each other to go outside and see if we could see him, but none of us were brave enough. And I think at one point or another, we finally fell asleep. Somehow, the next morning, we woke up pretty early, eager to go outside and see if we can find any tracks, but the snow had fallen so heavily over the night, there were virtually no tracks left. You could see very faint indents in the snow of where this thing came barreling down the hill from, and you could see the general direction that it took. It went right up against our cabin, actually, and even, most horrifying, appeared right outside our parents' windows, like it was right underneath, looking in. Probably sometime in the middle of the night. This chilled us to the bone. We even went back in and tried convincing our parents, but again, they didn't believe it. They thought we had made the tracks up, and simply would not listen. This large black shape seemed to be the hot topic between me and my cousins all day long. We'd go back and forth between playing, goofing off, and then talking about what this thing could be. One of us speculated that it was a big monster, while another speculated that it was some lost man trying to break into our place. We didn't know for sure. We were just 12, 13-year-old kids, trying to come up with the best explanation we could to whatever this person or thing was. As it got to about dinner time that night, and we're all sitting around getting dinner and eating dinner, we hear the loudest scream any of us have ever heard. It stops everybody in their tracks, and everybody in the cabin looks out towards the back window where the scream came from, far off over the hill. We all said, "What was that?" And all of our parents, straight-faced, looked at each other, looked at us. Nobody said a word. The rest of the dinner was pretty quiet, and I knew in that moment that they knew that wasn't just a bear, or a coyote, or an owl. That was from something none of us have ever heard before. And right before bed, probably maybe 8 or 9 this night, a few of our family members go out and gather some more wood from the outside shed. They both come back in and let us know that we're actually going to be heading home in the morning. Things are going to be cut a little short. There was hushed conversation between the adults. We all knew that they knew something was up, because this usually lasts for 4 to 5 days, and we'd only been here for 2 or 3. There is no reason why we should be cutting our trip short. They acted so weird about it. Even now, I wonder, what did they know that they never told us about? And why? Did they see something? Did they hear or encounter something? But when they came back in and announced it, Nobody was asking any questions or objecting. It was like it was a done deal. Enough said. We're going to go with it. So, that night, everybody packed up their stuff, and we left the following morning. No questions asked. I still wonder why that's the only time we've ever gone up there, and have had such a short trip. It's never made sense to me. And since that winter trip, we've gone back up there a dozen times, easily. Have never experienced, saw, or heard anything like what we did since. We also don't ask about it. It's kind of like a don't ask, don't tell policy, I guess. But I can guarantee you that something happened up there that winter. Whatever it was, I'll probably never know. The winters here in New York are long and dark. I've lived here almost my entire life, so I'm pretty much used to it. But last winter, it felt like it would never end. I think it had something to do with being stuck inside with a very energetic and inquisitive 3-year-old girl and a new baby boy. Oh, and by the way, this happened just before the whole lockdown, right in early March of last year. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love being able to stay home with my babies, but I would definitely say cabin fever had set in pretty bad. It was a pretty nice day, for being early March. The snow at this point was all melted, the sun shining, so I decided to take them for a nice walk right around the neighborhood. I told my daughter to go and find her boots while I was busy putting the baby in the stroller, tucking all the blankets in. My daughter loved walks because she really enjoyed seeing all the animals and dogs in the neighborhood. She didn't care. Big dogs or small dogs. She loved them all the same. I knew she would love to have one, so I figured we'd get one in the next few years. Anyway, it was a great day for being March in upstate New York. And I remember thinking, as we're walking on the sidewalk past our neighbor's house, that maybe I was finally getting the hang of parenting 2 children. It had been a big adjustment, and I knew my daughter needed much more attention than I felt like I had been able to give her at the time. But being happy at the moment, walking along the sidewalk, and just enjoying being a toddler. There were a lot of dogs walking that day, and she was having so much fun. Since we were all enjoying our walk, I thought it would be a great day to go on a longer walk. I mean, the weather was definitely permitting it. So, I decided to turn onto the paved trail on the edge of a wooded preserve, next to our neighborhood. Abby was busy singing Baby Shark, and being such a nice day, I didn't even mind. Then, all of a sudden, she stops and asked, "Is that a cute puppy?" I didn't see anybody on the trail, so I thought she was asking for a puppy, and told her we would probably see one soon. But she wouldn't budge, and kept staring into the woods. Louder, she said it again. "Cute puppy, Mommy, cute puppy." But she didn't sound happy. She was kind of scared. I kept telling her I didn't see a puppy, but I saw she was pointing into the woods. I saw it. It was not a cute puppy. I don't know what it was, but it appeared to be taller than a person. My first thought was I was looking at a bear, but it was standing like a person would, on 2 legs. Or at least that's what I thought, since it was kind of partially blocked by the foliage in the trees, even though in the winter, it's kind of non-existent. But there was enough branches and brush to kind of block any discernible shape. It started walking slowly toward us, and I held my finger to my lips, telling Abby to remain quiet. I'm surprised she listened. Now, my heart was pounding into my chest, and I was trying to plan our escape, when this animal walked into a clearing, and all of us saw it. It appeared to be a dog or wolf of some kind. At least, that's what the head was. But the body appeared to be this giant muscular person, covered in dark fur. I was questioning everything that I thought I knew. Was I looking at a werewolf? I just knew we had to get out of there, and quickly. Just then, out of nowhere, a deer comes running past us, and right past the beast, which immediately took off after the deer, heading away from us. Somebody might as well have ran by with a slab of steak on a stick. I grabbed my daughter's hand, told her to run. As we're running, we heard something like a scream, but it wasn't a human scream. At least, I don't think so. I don't know if it was the deer or this animal. My daughter asked what that was, and asked if it was a big doggy. I told her I didn't know, but everything would be fine. We just had to keep moving. And after that, the rest of the walk is kind of a blur. I barely remember getting us out of there. I tried so hard not to let Abby see how terrified and shaken I was after the encounter with what I later learned could only have been something called a Dogman, which apparently there's quite a bit of them here in New York. I know nothing of these animals, and have only barely heard about them. I didn't even think they were a thing, but I guess apparently werewolves are suddenly now real? But when I asked these questions, I found out that these are not werewolves, but something else entirely. Some sort of two-legged walking dog, I guess. Anyway, this was almost a year ago now, and I'm fortunate that this experience didn't alter or disturb my daughter in any way that was permanent. But I'll tell you what though, it's a walk I will never forget. Thank you for hearing my story. In the fall of 1997, a girl had gone missing in my town. At the time, I was only 24, and my brother was a volunteer firefighter. He actually asked me to be part of one of the search parties the town had organized to get together and look for her. We spent days sweeping parks, abandoned lots, and the forests all around town. But as the days passed, the search parties began to narrow and get smaller. But I stayed with it, as did most of the people on the crew. We did secondary sweeps of the deeper forested areas, knowing that she would be harder to find the further out we went. With fewer of us out there, we broke off alone, on solo, but were usually still within yelling distance of one another. And we also had communication, aka walkie-talkies. One afternoon, about an hour or so before dusk, I spotted some weird marks on the ground. I was keeping an eye out for footprints, either child-sized ones or adult ones. That mean someone had brought her there. But these tracks were not shoe prints. They appeared to be barefoot. A huge footprint, with marks at the toes. Almost kind of like claw marks. But the shape was decidedly human, and there were only 2 prints, meaning it had to have been a person, or something else that walks upright. I mean, what else are we talking here? A gorilla? It couldn't have been an animal. So I called out to another crew member to take a look, and unfortunately, he was just as confused as I. Since we couldn't rule out that they were human, although they were weird, we did follow them. We followed them for what felt like miles, and it was beginning to get late and getting dark. But we did not want to lose the marks overnight, just in case it rained and they washed away or became indiscernible. We radioed for help, got one other person, an older guy. He seemed even less convinced about the footprints, but due to the nature of the missing case, agreed to follow them with us. As dusk came, the footprints got harder and harder to see, even with flashlights, and they were pretty high quality, mind you. We had to slow down and search carefully now. It was starting to seem less and less likely that someone had carried this girl far, but we were not ready to give up on the only lead we'd had so far. While we were stumbling around in the near dark, we started hearing sounds. Someone or something walking, stepping on twigs and dry leaves right around us. We called out, thinking that it might be another member of the search party. Nobody answered, so we swung our flashlights around, but still no one saw. The sounds continued, and I thought about the marks. Whoever left them might still be here with us, and it could be someone dangerous, considering the circumstances. The three of us stood back to back, looking into the forest. I had a small knife with me, and the flashlights were heavy duty, but weren't exactly any kind of weapon. Finally, we saw a shape approaching. It was just a tall shadow, walking towards us, slowly and awkwardly. We called out some more, asking him to identify himself, but he did not answer. As he got closer, I noticed that his shape was all wrong. He was wider than a human, the head being way too big, and he was slightly hunched over, his legs bent backwards, almost like a dog, although he appeared to be walking upright. We pointed all three of our flashlights at what we thought was a person, or maybe a misidentified animal. We could tell pretty quickly that this was not a man, at least any man that we had ever seen, that it almost had certainly made the tracks. Whatever this animal was, it had almost certainly made the tracks that we were currently following, and it appeared to be on 2 feet, bipedally, and was also vaguely human-shaped. But the rest of it appeared to be canid of some kind, especially in the chest and head. It appeared to be covered in long canid fur, a little more stringy than a wolf, but still very much like a long-haired dog. Its face was pointed, and ears very much sticking straight up. Its mouth was open, and we could visibly see saliva dripping from its overabundance of unnatural, sharp teeth. It slowly stepped toward us, never taking its gaze off any of us. In fact, it was so intent, it stared straight into our eyes. The eyes were glowing faintly in the dark. We backed away as it advanced, moving back the way we came. It never changed its pace, neither did we. At least until this thing let out this monstrous howl, and then lunged. That's when we took off running. It took us a long time to get out to the woods. It was dark, we were panicked, so we managed to get lost. Occasionally, one of us would think that we saw this animal, and we'd start running again. It was chaos for that short time. We eventually made our way out, called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, we planned what we would tell them. All we could agree on was that it was some kind of half man or half dog or something. I don't know. One of us mentioned the idea of a werewolf, but it just seemed too ridiculous, and as far as mentioning it to the cops, wouldn't even waste our time. So we had ultimately just planned on saying that we had just followed these human footprints deep into the forest, and that we believed the person whoever took this little girl had made them. The police arrived and agreed to send a team in the following day, following our instructions to where we had lost the footprints. An entire days of search later, they returned, saying they did not find anything suspicious. They didn't say anything about the unknown animal we had witnessed the previous day, nearly trying to attack us. Turns out, 2 days later, the girl that had been missing was found, alive. She had somehow wandered off and got lost. It was a miracle that she was never eaten or attacked by this thing, especially when I think about what it is that we saw. It was so Blair Witch Project-esque. We made some general reports to animal control about maybe a wild dog in those woods, but as you can imagine, that request wasn't taken very seriously. But to this day, I can't explain what I saw in there. But I have never gone back in there. I mean, I'm not really a woodsy guy, so I would have no reason to. But just about under no circumstance will I ever go back in there.